This is my true story. 6 years ago, I found a 7-year-old girl abandoned on the steps of my church on a freezing November morning. She was wrapped in a thin blanket with a note saying her mother was dead and nobody wanted her. Something about her broke my heart, so I decided to adopt her and raise her as my own daughter. We built a beautiful life together, and I loved her more than anything. But on her 13th birthday, she showed me a box she had been hiding for years. What I discovered inside changed everything I thought I knew. Before I tell you what happened, tell us where you are watching from and subscribe. My wife left me 12 years ago in the cruelest way possible. I came home from work one evening and found the house empty. Her clothes were gone from the closet, her toiletries were gone from the bathroom, her car was gone from the driveway. There was no note, there was no explanation. She had simply packed her things while I was at work and vanished from my life. I called her phone over and over, but she never answered. I called her family and friends, but nobody would tell me where she was or why she left. A week later, I received divorce papers delivered by a lawyer I had never met. The papers were cold and formal. They said irreconcilable differences and requested division of assets. My wife had filed for divorce without ever speaking to me about it. She refused all contact with me. Every attempt I made to reach her was blocked by her lawyers. They told me she did not want to communicate and that everything would be handled through legal channels. I was devastated and confused and angry all at once. The divorce went through quickly because I did not fight it. What was the point of fighting to keep someone who clearly wanted nothing to do with me? I signed the papers and let her go, even though I did not understand why she had left. The lawyers divided our assets and our accounts. She took her share and I took mine. Within 3 months our marriage was legally over and I never heard from her again. She vanished into silence that swallowed all my questions whole. I learned years later through a mutual friend that my wife had been 3 months pregnant when she left me. She had known she was carrying my child when she walked out and filed for divorce. She had never told me about the baby. She had never given me a chance to be a father or to be part of my child's life. She had deliberately kept the pregnancy secret and cut me out completely. The betrayal of that knowledge was worse than the divorce itself. I did not know if the baby was a boy or a girl. I did not know where my wife had gone or who she was with. The mutual friend said she had moved to another state and married someone else quickly. She had started a new life with a new husband, and apparently she wanted no connection to her past or to me. My child was out there somewhere being raised by strangers, and I had no rights and no way to find them. The law said the baby was conceived during our marriage, but because she left before giving birth and because I did not know about the pregnancy, I had no legal standing. I tried to find information about my child for years. I hired a private investigator who tracked my ex-wife to another state, but could not get any details about whether she had actually given birth or what happened to the baby. My ex-wife had covered her tracks well. She used her new married name. She lived in a place where I had no connections. Every attempt I made to get information was blocked by privacy laws and by her deliberate efforts to hide from me. Eventually, I gave up searching. It was too painful and too expensive and too hopeless. I accepted that I had a child somewhere in the world that I would never know. I accepted that my ex-wife had stolen my chance at being a father. I accepted that some questions would never be answered. The grief of losing both my wife and my unknown child nearly destroyed me. I fell into a deep depression that lasted for years. I never remarried. I never moved on. I just existed in the shadow of a life that had been stolen from me without explanation. I worked long hours to avoid coming home to an empty house. I avoided relationships because I could not trust anyone after what my wife had done. I lived alone with my pain and my unanswered questions for years. The only place I found any peace was at church on Sundays, where the silence felt comforting instead of crushing. That church would eventually change my life in a way I never could have imagined. I spent years drowning in the wreckage of my wife's abandonment. The house I had shared with her became a tomb of memories I could not escape. Every room reminded me of what I had lost. The bedroom where we used to sleep together. The kitchen where we used to cook meals. The living room where we used to watch television curled up on the couch. I could not afford to move and I could not bring myself to change anything, so I just lived there surrounded by ghosts. I worked long hours at my job as a warehouse manager because work was the only thing that kept me from thinking about my empty life. I would arrive early and stay late. I would volunteer for overtime shifts on weekends. My coworkers thought I was dedicated, but really, I was just avoiding going home. Home meant silence and loneliness and the crushing weight of everything I had lost. Work meant distraction and purpose, and not having to face my pain. The house still smelled like her perfume years after she left. I found bottles of it in the bathroom cabinet that she had left behind. Sometimes I would open one and smell it, and the scent would transport me back to happier times. Then the memories would turn bitter, and I would put the bottle away and feel angry at myself for still caring about someone who had destroyed me. I should have thrown away everything that reminded me of her, but I could not. I was stuck. I never dated or tried to meet anyone new. Friends and coworkers would suggest I should get back out there and find someone. They said I was still young enough to start over and find happiness again. But I had no interest in relationships. I could not trust anyone after what my wife had done. She had seemed happy with me. She had seemed committed to our marriage. And then one day she just left without warning or explanation. If someone who promised to love me forever could do that, what hope did I have with anyone else? I became isolated and withdrawn. I stopped going out with friends. I stopped accepting invitations to social events. I made excuses about being busy or tired. Eventually, people stopped inviting me, and I was left alone with my misery. I convinced myself I preferred it that way. I told myself I did not need people or relationships or happiness. I just needed to get through each day, and that was enough. But it was not enough. I was slowly dying inside. The only place I found any solace was church on Sundays. I started attending services at a small church near my house. I was not particularly religious, but there was something comforting about sitting in the quiet sanctuary surrounded by other people. The hymns and the prayers and the sense of community gave me a brief respite from my loneliness. For 1 hour a week, I felt like maybe I was part of something bigger than my own pain. I went to the same church every Sunday morning. I sat in the same pew in the back. I did not talk to anyone or participate in social activities. I just attended the service and then left. The regulars recognized me, but they left me alone, sensing I was not ready for conversation or connection. The pastor would nod at me as I left, and I would nod back. That was the extent of my human interaction most weeks. The silence at church felt like peace instead of punishment. At home, the silence was oppressive and reminded me I was alone. But at church, the silence felt sacred and meaningful. It was a different kind of quiet. A quiet that acknowledged pain, but also offered hope that things could get better someday. I did not really believe things would get better for me, but the possibility was comforting even if it felt distant and unrealistic. I lived this way for 6 years after my wife left, working too much, coming home to an empty house, going to church on Sundays, existing but not really living. I had accepted that this was my life now. I had accepted that I would probably die alone, having never experienced real happiness again. I had no idea that one cold November morning would change everything and give me a reason to live again. 6 years ago, on a freezing November morning, I arrived at church earlier than usual. The service did not start for another hour, but I had woken up early and could not go back to sleep. The house felt particularly suffocating that morning, so I decided to drive to the church and sit in my car until the doors opened. It was one of those bitter cold mornings where the wind cut through your coat and your breath came out in clouds. The sky was gray and threatening snow. As I pulled into the church parking lot, I saw something on the front steps that should not have been there. At first, I thought it was a pile of blankets or garbage that someone had left. But as I got closer, I realized the pile was moving. I parked quickly and got out of my car and walked toward the steps. What I saw made my heart stop. There was a child sitting on the cold concrete steps, wrapped in a thin blanket. A little girl who looked about 7 years old, shivering in the freezing temperature. I rushed up the steps and knelt down beside her. She looked up at me with hollow, terrified eyes. Her lips were blue from the cold. Her small body was trembling violently. She did not speak or cry out. She just stared at me like she had given up hope that anyone would help her. I immediately took off my coat and wrapped it around her on top of the thin blanket she already had. I asked her what she was doing out here and where her parents were, but she did not answer. That is when I noticed the note pinned to her shirt. It was written on a torn piece of notebook paper in handwriting that looked rushed and angry. The note said, "Her mother is dead, and I cannot keep her, and please help." There was no name on the note, no contact information, no explanation of who had written it, or why this child had been abandoned on church steps like she was garbage someone wanted to throw away. Just those few cruel words rejecting a terrified little girl. I picked her up, and she did not resist. Her small body was so cold and light. I carried her inside the church through the side door that was always unlocked. The building was empty and dark because I was the only one there this early. I found the kitchen and turned on lights and started making hot tea. I wrapped more blankets around her that I found in the supply closet. I rubbed her hands trying to warm them up. She still had not spoken. She just stared at me with those huge, empty eyes. Something in her face broke my heart in a way I cannot fully explain. Maybe it was the way she had been discarded by someone who was supposed to protect her. Maybe it was the fear and resignation in her expression, like she had learned not to expect kindness from anyone. Maybe it was because I saw my own abandonment reflected in her situation. Whatever it was, I felt something wake up inside me that had been dormant for 6 years. I felt protective and angry and determined that this child would not be alone anymore. I called the police and social services and waited with her until they arrived. I held her hand and told her she was safe now. I told her people would help her and find her a good home. She gripped my hand tightly but still did not speak. When the social workers arrived to take her, I felt an unexpected pain at letting her go. I had only known this child for 2 hours, but I already felt connected to her in a way that surprised me. The social workers said they would try to find family members or figure out who had abandoned her. They said she would go to a temporary shelter until a placement could be found. I asked if I could visit her, and they said yes. As they led her away wrapped in blankets, she looked back at me one time. That look stayed with me. It was a look that said, "Please do not forget about me." And I knew in that moment, I never would. Social services worked for weeks trying to locate any family members who would take the little girl. They searched for relatives on both her mother's side and her father's side. They contacted everyone they could find, but nobody was willing to take her. Some relatives said they could not afford another child. Some said they did not have space. Some just refused without giving a reason. It became clear that this child had been unwanted by everyone in her family, not just by whoever abandoned her on the church steps. Foster homes in our area were completely overflowing. There was a shortage of foster families and too many children needing placement. The social worker told me the girl would probably end up in a group home facility because there were no foster families available. Group homes were better than nothing, but they were not ideal for a traumatized 7-year-old who needed individual attention and stability. The thought of her ending up in an institutional setting bothered me more than it should have. I found myself visiting her at the temporary shelter almost every day. I would stop by after work and bring her books and stuffed animals and small toys. At first, she would just stare at the gifts without touching them like she did not trust that they were really for her. But slowly over weeks, she started to warm up. She would pick up the books and flip through the pages. She would hold the stuffed animals and hug them. And eventually she started to smile when I walked into the room. Watching her slowly come out of her shell did something to me. For 6 years, I had been emotionally dead, just going through the motions of living. But this little girl made me feel something again. She made me want to be better and do better. She gave me a purpose beyond just surviving each day. I started looking forward to my visits with her. I started thinking about her constantly when I was not there. I started imagining what it would be like to give her a real home. The social worker pulled me aside one day and asked if I had ever considered fostering or adoption. She said the girl had formed an attachment to me that was unusual given her trauma. She said most abandoned children had trouble trusting adults, but this girl seemed to trust me. She said if I was interested in becoming her foster parent, they could fast-track the approval process. The suggestion caught me off guard because I had not seriously considered it until that moment. I went home that night and thought about what it would mean to become a father. I was 52 years old and had never raised a child. I lived alone in a house that was too quiet and too empty. I had no experience with children and no idea if I would be any good at parenting. But I also knew that this little girl needed someone and that I was the only person who seemed to want her. Maybe we could help each other. Maybe we both needed to not be alone anymore. 6 months after I found her on the church steps, I signed adoption papers with trembling hands. The process had been faster than normal because there were no other options for her placement, and because the social workers believed I was a good match. I became a legal father to a stranger's abandoned daughter because nobody else would step up. The day the adoption was finalized, I brought her home to my house, which suddenly felt less empty and more like it had purpose again. I named her Grace because finding her on those church steps felt like undeserved mercy. I had been dead inside for 6 years, and she brought me back to life. She had been abandoned and unwanted, and I gave her a home and a family. We saved each other in ways that neither of us fully understood at the time. I became her father, and she became my daughter, and we started building a life together. I had no idea then that our connection went deeper than adoption. I had no idea that fate had brought us together for reasons I would not discover for 7 more years. Grace was quiet and careful and haunted by whatever trauma had led to her being abandoned on those church steps. The social workers had told me she had been through things no child should experience, but they did not have many details. Her mother was dead. Someone had discarded her like trash. Those facts alone were enough to cause serious psychological damage. I knew healing her would take time and patience and more love than I had given anyone in years. She did not speak for the first 3 months she lived with me, not a single word. The doctors said it was selective mutism brought on by trauma. She could speak physically, but she had shut down emotionally and refused to use her voice. I did not push her. I just talked to her throughout the day, telling her what I was doing and asking questions I did not expect her to answer. I wanted her to know I was there and that it was safe to communicate when she was ready. She flinched whenever I moved too quickly near her. If I raised my hand suddenly or turned around fast, she would instinctively duck or step back. It was clear she had been hit or hurt by adults before. I made myself move slowly and deliberately around her. I announced what I was doing before I did it. I gave her space and let her come to me instead of forcing physical contact. Gradually, over months, she stopped flinching as much. She hoarded food in her bedroom like it might disappear. I would find crackers and bread and fruit hidden in her closet and under her bed. She was terrified of not having enough to eat. I realized she must have gone hungry before. Maybe her mother had not fed her properly. Maybe whoever abandoned her had neglected her basic needs. I started letting her help me grocery shop so she could see we had plenty of food. I kept snacks in her room openly so she did not feel the need to hide them. Slowly, over many months, love and patience chipped away at her fear. She started to relax in my presence. She started to smile more. She started to play with her toys instead of just staring at them. She started to eat meals with me at the table instead of taking food to her room. Little by little, the terrified, hollow-eyed child I had found on the church steps transformed into a little girl who could feel safe and loved. She started speaking again around the 4-month mark. Just small words at first. Yes and no, and thank you. Then short sentences. Then actual conversations. Her voice was soft and hesitant, but it was there. I celebrated every word like it was a miracle because in many ways it was. She was learning to trust again, and that was the hardest thing for a traumatized child to do. The moment that changed everything happened 8 months after she came to live with me. We were having breakfast and I asked her to pass the orange juice. She handed it to me and said, "Here you go, Dad." The word dad was so casual and natural, like she had been saying it forever. But it was the first time she had called me that. I froze with the juice container in my hand. I looked at her, and she was looking back at me, waiting to see how I would react. I felt tears forming in my eyes. This little girl who had been abandoned and traumatized had just claimed me as her father. She had chosen to give me that title. I said, "Thank you, Grace," and my voice cracked with emotion. She smiled at me and went back to eating her cereal like nothing monumental had just happened. But for me, it was everything. My broken heart that had been shattered 6 years ago when my wife left began beating properly again for the first time. Grace calling me Dad meant she felt safe with me, It meant she trusted me. It meant she saw me as her family. For a child who had been rejected by everyone in her life to choose me as her father was the greatest gift I had ever received. I had adopted her to save her, but she was saving me just as much. We were healing each other and building a real family together. As Grace grew older, something started nagging at the edges of my awareness. It was subtle at first. Small things I noticed but dismissed as coincidence or imagination. The curve of her smile reminded me of someone, but I could not place who. The way she laughed had a particular rhythm that felt achingly familiar. The stubborn set of her jaw when she argued with me about homework or bedtime looked like something I had seen before, but I could not remember where. Her mannerisms sometimes struck me as eerily similar to my own. She would tilt her head the same way I did when she was thinking. She would tap her fingers on the table when she was impatient exactly the way I did. She had little gestures and expressions that mirrored mine in a way that seemed too specific to be random. I told myself adopted children often picked up behaviors from their parents. It made sense that she would copy me after living with me for years. But there were physical features that bothered me more. The shape of her nose. The color of her eyes, which were an unusual shade of gray-green that I rarely saw. The way her hair grew in a specific pattern at her hairline. These were not behaviors she learned from me. These were genetic features that reminded me of someone from my past, but my brain refused to make the connection. Maybe because the connection was too impossible to believe. I would catch glimpses of her face at certain angles and feel a jolt of recognition. I would see her concentrating on a book, and something about her expression would trigger a memory I could not quite grasp. I would watch her sleep and study her features and wonder why she looked so familiar. But I always dismissed these feelings as a lonely man seeing ghosts where there were none. I was projecting meaning onto coincidence because I wanted to feel connected to her. Friends and acquaintances who met Grace would sometimes comment that she looked like she could be my biological daughter. They said we had similar features and mannerisms. I would laugh it off and say adopted children often resembled their parents after spending enough time together. But the comments happened often enough that they started to accumulate in my mind. Multiple people seeing a resemblance made it harder to dismiss as imagination. Grace was approaching her 13th birthday, and the resemblance had become more pronounced as she matured. Her facial structure was settling into more defined features. Her personality was fully formed. And the more I looked at her, the more I felt like I was looking at someone I should recognize. The feeling was maddening because I could not identify who she reminded me of. My mind had somehow blocked the connection, even though the evidence was right in front of me. On the evening before her 13th birthday, Grace came to me looking nervous and serious. She said she wanted to talk to me about something important. She said she had questions about her birth mother and where she came from. She said she knew I did not have much information because she had been abandoned, but she wanted to know whatever I could tell her. She said she was old enough now to hear the truth about her past. I sat down with her and told her everything I knew, which was not much. I told her about finding her on the church steps. I told her about the note pinned to her shirt saying her mother was dead. I told her that social services had not been able to find any family willing to take her. I told her that I had adopted her because I loved her and wanted to give her a home. She listened quietly and nodded like she had expected these answers. Then she said there was something she had never told me. She said she had a box of items from before she was abandoned. She had kept the box hidden all these years because she was afraid someone would take it away. But she trusted me now, and she wanted to show me what was inside. She said maybe the items would help answer questions about where she came from. She went to her room and returned carrying a small metal box. She placed it on the table between us and slowly opened the lid. What I saw inside would destroy and rebuild my entire understanding of reality. Grace had kept the small metal box hidden in her closet for 7 years. She had protected it fiercely, never letting anyone see inside. The social workers had known she had some personal items, but they had never forced her to show them. They had respected her need to hold on to something from her past. She had carried the box with her through the temporary shelter and through the adoption process and into my home. And now, on the eve of her 13th birthday, she was finally ready to share what was inside. She opened the lid slowly and carefully, like the contents were precious and fragile. Inside the box were a few items that looked old and worn. She pulled out each item one by one and placed them on the table. The first item was a photograph. It showed a woman holding a newborn baby in a hospital bed. The woman looked tired but happy. The baby was wrapped in a pink blanket. Grace said this was the only photo she had of her mother holding her. My hands started to shake as I looked at the photograph. The woman in the picture was unmistakably my ex-wife. The face I had tried to forget for 12 years was staring back at me from a photo of her holding a newborn baby. Her hair was different and she looked younger, but it was absolutely her. There was no doubt. I felt like the room was spinning. I could not breathe. This could not be real. This had to be some kind of mistake or hallucination. Grace pulled out the second item, which was a hospital bracelet, the kind they put on newborn babies to identify them. The bracelet was pink and had information printed on it in faded ink. It read, "Baby girl born to Sarah Mitchell." Sarah Mitchell was my ex-wife's maiden name. The date on the bracelet was exactly 9 months after my wife left me. The pieces were falling into place in my mind, but I could not accept what they were telling me. The third item was a death certificate. Grace said this was her mother's death certificate. The certificate showed that Sarah Mitchell had died in a car accident 7 years ago. The date of death was about 6 months before Grace was abandoned on the church steps. The certificate confirmed that the woman in the photograph was dead, and that woman was my ex-wife. The woman who had left me 12 years ago had died 7 years ago, and somehow her daughter had ended up abandoned at my church. I stared at the items on the table, unable to speak. My brain was trying to process impossible information. The little girl sitting across from me was the daughter of my ex-wife. But that meant she was also my daughter. My ex-wife had been pregnant when she left me. She had given birth to our child 1 month after our divorce. She had raised that child in secret with a new husband, and when she died, that child had been abandoned. That child was Grace. My adopted daughter was my biological daughter. Grace was looking at me with concern. She asked if I was okay because my face had gone white. She asked if I knew the woman in the photograph. I could not form words. I just nodded. She asked how I knew her. I managed to whisper that the woman was my ex-wife. Grace's eyes went wide. She said, "But that means..." She could not finish the sentence. She was starting to understand what I was understanding. I picked up the photograph again and looked at it closely. Now that I knew who the woman was, I could see Grace's features in the baby's face. The same nose, the same shape of the eyes. The resemblance I had been noticing for years suddenly made perfect sense. Grace looked like my ex-wife. She looked like me. She looked like us because she was ours. The child I had unknowingly been raising for 7 years was the child my ex-wife had stolen from me 12 years ago by leaving without telling me she was pregnant. I started crying. Years of grief and confusion and pain came pouring out. Grace looked terrified. She asked if she had done something wrong by showing me the box. I shook my head and pulled her into a hug. I told her she had done nothing wrong. I told her we needed to do a DNA test to confirm what I already knew in my heart. She was my daughter. She had always been my daughter. And somehow, through tragedy and abandonment, she had been returned to me. Over the next few days, I pieced together what must have happened using the information from Grace's box and some investigation. My ex-wife had given birth to our daughter, Sarah. Grace, exactly 1 month after our divorce was finalized 12 years ago. She had used her maiden name on the birth certificate and hospital records, which explained why I never found any trace of the baby when I searched for information years ago. She had deliberately hidden the birth from me and from anyone who might tell me about it. She had moved to another state and married a man named Robert within months of giving birth. The timeline suggested she might have been involved with Robert even before she left me, which would explain the sudden departure without explanation. She started a new life with her new husband and my daughter. She raised Grace for the first 6 years of her life, keeping her existence secret from me. She made sure I had no idea I was a father. She stole that from me deliberately and completely. Robert apparently resented Grace from the beginning. According to records I found, and people I talked to, Robert had made it clear he did not want to raise another man's child. He tolerated Grace while my ex-wife was alive, but he never treated her as his own daughter. He was cold and distant to her. Grace had vague memories of a man who ignored her and made her feel unwanted. That man had been her stepfather, who saw her as a burden and a reminder that his wife had a past. 2 years after marrying Robert, my ex-wife died in a car accident. The accident happened on a rainy night when her car hydroplaned and crashed into a barrier. She died instantly. Grace was only 6 years old and suddenly motherless. The only parent she had ever known was gone. That should have been the moment when Robert stepped up and became a real father to the little girl who had lost everything. But Robert did not step up. Robert did exactly the opposite. Within 6 months of my ex-wife's death, Robert abandoned Grace. He could not legally put her up for adoption without her biological father's consent, and he did not want to involve me, because that would expose what my ex-wife had done. So he took the coward's way out. He drove Grace to a church on a freezing November morning. He left her on the steps with a note saying her mother was dead and he could not keep her. Then he disappeared, leaving a traumatized 6-year-old to fend for herself. Grace had been abandoned twice in her short life. First by her mother's lies, which kept her from knowing her real father. Then by her stepfather's cruelty, which literally left her on church steps like garbage. For 6 years, I had been unknowingly raising my own biological daughter. The child my ex-wife had hidden from me had been returned to me through the most tragic circumstances imaginable. She had been abandoned at the one place I went every week. The church where I found solace had been the location where my stolen daughter was left for me to find. The coincidence was too perfect to be random. Out of all the churches in all the cities Robert could have chosen, he picked mine. Either he had researched where I lived and deliberately left Grace somewhere I would find her, or it was an act of God returning my daughter to me. Either way, Grace had ended up exactly where she was supposed to be. She had ended up with her real father who loved her and wanted her even before knowing she was his. My ex-wife had stolen my chance to be a father for the first 6 years of Grace's life. She had robbed me of seeing my daughter as a baby and a toddler and a young child. She had denied me the chance to be there for first words and first steps and first days of school. That loss was permanent, and nothing could give me those years back. But she had not succeeded in keeping Grace from me forever. Despite all the lies and all the cruelty, fate had brought my daughter home to me, and now I finally knew the truth. I ordered a DNA test kit online with shaking hands. Even though my heart already knew the truth, my brain needed scientific confirmation. I needed to see it in writing that Grace was mine. The test kit arrived 2 days later, and I explained to Grace what we needed to do. I told her we would swab our cheeks and send the samples to a lab. I told her the results would tell us definitively if we were biologically related. She nodded and said she already knew what the results would show. She said she had felt connected to me from the moment I found her on those church steps. We collected the samples according to the instructions and mailed them to the laboratory. The waiting period was supposed to be 2 weeks, but it felt like an eternity. Every day I checked the mail hoping the results had arrived early. Every night I lay awake thinking about what it meant that Grace was my daughter. I thought about the 12 years my ex-wife had stolen from me. I thought about how Grace had suffered because of adult lies and cruelty. I thought about how we had found each other despite everything working against us. Grace was anxious during the waiting period too. She asked me multiple times if the results would change anything between us. She was afraid that if the test showed we were not related, I would not want her anymore. I assured her over and over that nothing would change my love for her. I told her she was my daughter in every way that mattered, regardless of what biology said. But I also believed biology would confirm what we both felt. We belonged together. The results came back exactly 2 weeks after we sent the samples. I opened the envelope with trembling hands while Grace watched nervously. The report was several pages of technical information and graphs. But the conclusion was clear and simple. The DNA test showed a 99.9% probability of paternity. Grace was my biological daughter. The test confirmed with scientific certainty what I had known in my heart from the moment I saw that photograph of my ex-wife holding a newborn baby. I showed Grace the results and watched her face transform from nervous anticipation to shock to overwhelming relief. She started crying, and so did I. We held each other while the weight of this revelation settled over us. For 7 years, we had been father and daughter through adoption and love. Now we knew we had been father and daughter all along through blood and fate. The child I had chosen to raise was the child I had been meant to raise from the moment she was born. Grace had been stolen from me by my ex-wife's lies. She had been hidden from me for 6 years while being raised by a woman who kept secrets and a man who did not want her. She had been abandoned by her stepfather after her mother died. She had been left on church steps in freezing weather to die or be found by strangers. But through all of that tragedy and cruelty, she had been returned to me. She had been brought back to her real father, who would love her and protect her and give her the life she deserved. The DNA results confirmed that Grace was mine, but they also confirmed something else. My ex-wife had known she was pregnant when she left me. She had made a conscious choice to hide the pregnancy and raise my daughter with another man. She had robbed me of fatherhood deliberately and without remorse. She had stolen 6 years of my daughter's life from me. I would never get those years back. I would never know what Grace was like as a baby or a toddler. Those memories belonged to my ex-wife and to Robert. But I had Grace now, and that was what mattered. I looked at Grace sitting across from me holding the DNA results in her hands. My daughter. My stolen daughter who had been abandoned twice and returned to me by what felt like divine intervention. We had been brought together by tragedy, but we had built something beautiful. We had become a real family. And now we knew the truth that had been written in our resemblance all along. I sat Grace down the evening after we received the DNA results and showed her the paperwork one more time. I wanted to make sure she fully understood what this meant for both of us. I told her that the woman in the photograph was not just someone I used to know. She was my wife, who had left me 12 years ago. And the baby in that photograph was her, which meant I was her biological father. I had been her father all along, even before I adopted her. We were connected by blood, and by fate, and by 7 years of building a life together. Grace looked at me with tears in her eyes and asked the question that mattered most to her. She whispered, "Are you my real dad?" Her voice was small and uncertain, like she was afraid of the answer. I understood her fear. She had been abandoned and rejected so many times that she could not quite believe she finally belonged somewhere. She could not believe that someone actually wanted her. She needed to hear me say it clearly without any doubt. I took her hands in mine and looked directly into her eyes. I said, "You were always my real dad." I said, "From the moment you were born, you were mine, even though I did not know you existed." I said, "Your mother took you away from me, but life brought you back." I said, "I loved you before I knew you were my daughter, and I love you even more now that I know the truth." I said nothing about this changes, except now we understand why we always felt so connected. We were meant to be together. She broke down crying and threw her arms around me. She sobbed into my shoulder and said she had always felt like she belonged with me. She said even when she was little and scared and traumatized, she had felt safe with me in a way she never felt with anyone else. She said it made sense now why she had trusted me so quickly. She said some part of her must have recognized me as her father, even when neither of us knew the truth. We held each other and cried together, releasing years of pain and confusion. I explained to her that she had been found at a church and given the name Grace. I told her I had chosen that name because finding her felt like undeserved mercy. I had been dead inside for 6 years after my wife left. I had been living without purpose or hope. And then I found a little girl on church steps who needed me as much as I needed her. Now I understood why the moment had felt so significant. God or fate or the universe had brought my stolen daughter back to me through the very act of abandonment that was meant to destroy us both. Grace said she understood now why I had seemed so familiar to her from the beginning. She said she had memories of being very young and being scared all the time. But when she met me, she felt calm. She said she could not explain it at the time, but now it made sense. I was her father. Even though we had been separated for 6 years and she had no conscious memory of me, something deeper had recognized our connection. Biology and love had guided her back to where she belonged. We spent the rest of the evening talking about everything. I told her about my marriage to her mother and the argument we had before she left. I told her about the years I spent searching for information about the baby I never got to meet. I told her how I had given up hope of ever knowing my child. Grace told me what she remembered about her early childhood. Vague memories of her mother and of Robert, who had been cold and mean. Memories of being scared and alone after her mother died. And then the memory of being left on church steps and the terror of thinking nobody would help her. She said finding me had saved her life. I said finding her had saved mine. We had both been lost and broken, and we had found each other and become whole. She was my daughter. I was her father. The truth had finally been revealed, and we could move forward as the family we were always meant to be.